The topic of casual and newer players in Flesh and Blood is something that comes up time and time again. I'm sure we've all had the same experience of having someone new come into the game, absolutely love it, and start showing up at locals every week. But over the course of a few months, if they aren't able to afford a fully tuned deck and they're still learning the game, they start to get a little frustrated with losing over and over, and then one day they just don't show up again. The reality is, Flesh and Blood is incredibly easy to start playing, but it can be a struggle to retain new and casual players. Between the price of cards and the steep learning curve, Fab can be a bit ruthless to anyone who's looking to play it as just a casual hobby. If you're an at-home player, or if you're a competitive player who's looking to go to tournaments to compete for cash prizes, then this video is likely more or less irrelevant to you. But I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of people out there who, like myself, just play at the armory level, and all you want is to be able to get on a more even footing with the other players without having to take out a bank loan and spend hours grinding at the game. So in this video, I want to break down what I think are Flesh and Blood's biggest hurdles for new and casual players and offer some potential solutions to these problems. There are two main hurdles that I believe Flesh and Blood presents to the new and casual player: price and difficulty. And while these two issues have their own set of problems, they end up feeding into each other to create what I feel is less of a hill to climb and more like a wall to scale. Starting with price, this is something that the game is unfortunately well known for. Now, I already did an entire video on this, and I'll link it below if you want to go watch it, but because I've already spent over 20 minutes on the topic, I will be brief here. Flesh and Blood has always been, and likely will always be, an expensive game to play competitively. Generic staples, legendaries, and even powerful class cards will cost a fair amount, and sometimes these are cards that define entire decks. Back in the day, the pool of expensive cards was much smaller, making it easier to build a strong budget deck. But over the past year or so, the game has seen a good amount of growth, and it's resulted in prices going up across the board. You were once able to skip the legendaries and cards like Command and Conquer and build everything else pretty cheap, but now you'll often need to spend a couple hundred just to get the core Majestics for a deck. Add in those staples and legendaries, and decks can easily rack up hundreds of dollars, often pushing over 1,000 for the fully tuned lists. Now, of course, the benefit here is that most of this price is still in the staple cards, and if you buy your set for one deck, you have them for all your decks in the future. It's a high buy-in price, but comes with a lot of longevity. But for a brand new player who just wants to play the game as a fun hobby at their weekly armories, the price can be very off-putting. Of course, this is just for the competitive decks, and you could very well argue that new players don't need cards like Command and Conquer or Tunic. I mean, after all, they're just playing at armories. It's not like they need the best cards, right?
That is not correct.
See, I know that armories are supposed to be a more relaxed and casual space, as LSS themselves have done things like making participatory gem packs in order to foster a more social rather than competitive environment. And don't get me wrong, these have worked to an extent, but at the end of the day, this is a 1v1 game, and even if there's no prizes on the line, people are still going to build and play their strongest decks, even if they themselves aren't tournament grinders. I'll use myself as an example. See, I don't play at pretty much anything past the armory level. I don't even travel to ProQuest or RTNs because I'm just not that interested in being a competitive player. I like to sit back and relax, shooting the shit and just having fun playing the game. I find competitive events to be pretty stressful, although I think that like 90% of that is that I'm just terrified I'm gonna make an honest mistake and then everyone's gonna think I'm a cheater. But just because I'm not interested in competing at a bunch of events doesn't mean that I want to be bad at Flesh and Blood. And if I really like a hero, well, you can bet your ass that I'm going to build the tuned list if I have the cards. So even though I'm not a try-hard player who grinds games with a testing team and figuring out every single matchup, I mean, my decks are just gonna be way stronger than the moderately upgraded armory deck that a newer player is probably using. Not only does the price of this game present a problem in and of itself, but it also ties directly into the other hurdle new and casual players face: the skill gap. Let's be real, even if you gave a new player a top tier $1,000 deck, chances are they aren't going to be beating the experienced players right away. I've played a total of 6 different card games for varying periods of time, and out of them, I can say that for myself, Flesh and Blood was the hardest to learn and get good at. See, one of the things about this game that I absolutely love is the agency created by having cards do multiple things. You can attack with or play a card, block with it, pitch it, or arsenal it and save it for later. This, combined with the constant refreshing of your hand at the end of your turns, creates an absolutely amazing game system that feels fluid, interactive, but very complex. Now, this complexity and depth is a strength of Flesh and Blood, don't get me wrong, but it does make the game pretty hard to get a grasp on, at least for most players. I know it took me months to even start being okay-ish at the game, and even 4 years later, I'm just like pretty good. I like to think I'm above average at this point, but put me in a room with some pro players and you might as well stick a wooden pole up my ass because they will mop the floor with me. But the thing is, even someone like myself will present a huge skill gap for most new players. I mean, sure, we've all probably met somebody who joins Fab and it just clicks for them right away. And by the way, if that's you, flick you. I am very jealous of that. But I think for most people, it takes a bit of time to really start getting the game. And if you're a much more casual player and you're not spending a lot of extra time outside your armories on Flesh and Blood, well, that skill gap can be considerably overwhelming. Now, here's the thing. The difficulty hurdle is one that can only be overcome by playing more. But let's be real. When you're less skilled than your opponent and they're playing decks that are far stronger and much more expensive than yours, well, even if you love this game, it can quickly start to feel like you're just beating your head against a wall for no reason. These two hurdles work together to make it pretty rough for a more casual player to stick around. While at the start, most people are fine picking up an armory deck and losing most, if not all of their games, there is a limit to how much shit kicking a player can withstand. Because sure, given enough time, you could probably overcome the skill gap issue by improving at the game, but would it even matter if you're not able to build the top tier decks and keep up with the meta? Now, I want to be clear on one thing here though. These issues that new and casual players have are not exclusive to Flesh and Blood, despite what some people might say. These exact same issues have existed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Since time immemorial, and even Magic the Gathering's Commander format isn't the perfect safe haven that people think it is. Wizards of the Coast just had to create a bracket system in order to try and tackle the issue of people with wildly different deck power levels and price playing in the same pod. But while these issues aren't exclusive to Flesh and Blood, it doesn't mean that they can't or shouldn't be addressed, at least a little bit. And so in order to not just complain about these problems, I'd like to offer a few solutions that I think could help make Flesh and Blood a more accessible game, specifically at the armory level. If you've gotten to this point in the video, you may have noticed that aside from mentioning the armory decks, I never actually specified what format I was discussing. And that's because I'm willing to bet that you probably already assumed it was Classic Constructed. While I'm aware that things like Blitz are played at like 3 LGSs, I'm willing to bet that, especially since the release of armory decks, Classic Constructed is the format most players engage in. But CC is a very competitive format and is also very expensive. And so a common solution to the issues new and casual players face that most people mention is the adoption of more casual friendly formats at the local levels. Formats like Commoner and even the fan-made Clash are dirt cheap to build decks for, and so they can even the playing field on the cost end of things, allowing players to focus on improving their skills instead. These are far better than Blitz in this regard, since Blitz is still a pretty expensive format to play, even with only 2 copies of each card instead of 3. Limited formats could also work to this degree. I mean, sure, they're a little more skill intensive since you have to be able to build a deck as well as pilot it, but it still removes the problem of one person playing a $1,000 deck versus a $150 deck. And finally, there's the multiplayer format Ultimate Pit Fight, which is essentially this game's version of Commander. Being multiplayer, you can make up for having both a worse deck and being a worse player by leaning into the social aspect. If you're the least experienced player at the table, most people are likely to leave you alone more, and so you might even be able to win a game here and there because you just get left alone long enough to swoop in and kill the last remaining opponent. Fostering a community around these formats could do a lot of good for a store's ability to retain newer players, as removing barriers, namely the cost, can do a lot of good. However, there's one issue with this solution. No one else wants to play these formats. Okay, so that's a bit hyperbolic. Obviously, people do play these formats. It's just not the majority. And if an LGS has been hosting nothing but CC for months, if not years, then chances are if they try something like Commoner or UPF, people just aren't going to show up. And it's not necessarily because these formats are bad. It's just that people only have so much time to spend on their hobbies. And if you're already invested in Classic Constructed, you probably just don't have the ability to play or care about other formats. On top of that, while I'm sure casual players would enjoy something like Commoner, I'm not sure most people would actually want that to be the solution. While some would love to have a format more catered to their needs, I think most people who are interested in Flesh and Blood want to play the same thing everyone else is, aka Classic Constructed. It's just that the price and difficulty act as steep barriers. But if you're a tournament organizer, store owner, or the enfranchised player at your store, it could very well be worth at least trying to get a format like Commoner or Clash going, because it really does make the barrier of entry much easier to overcome. Most players are fine with having to improve their skills, but much less so with spending a ton of money just to do it. That all said, I'm willing to bet that there are plenty of stores that have tried to get something other than Classic Constructed going, and it just never works. And I think a big part of it is just that Flesh and Blood isn't big enough yet to properly support multiple formats. So because of this, I think that the best way to make the game more accessible at the moment is instead making the main format of the game itself easier to get into. And this is where I want to go into 2 more substantial solutions that could come from LSS directly. The first is reprints. That's it. I'm pretty sure at this point we're all on board with the fact that the game has been growing in popularity, which is great, but it has made card prices go a little nuts, and it's getting more and more expensive to build decks for this game, even if you leave out the most egregious cards. Like I said, I've already done an entire video on this already, but I think we've reached a point where reprints are becoming more and more necessary, and while LSS is not a company that wants to tank the value of their cards and screw over the existing players, I do think it's fair to lower the cost of entry to at least a reasonable degree. But while something like reprints in the expansion slot, or even a full reprint set, would be great, I think that another spot for more reprints is also where I think LSS can make the greatest change to the hurdles this game presents for new and casual players: the armory decks. Now, I've talked at length about these more than once, but I truly believe that these are the game's most powerful and impactful product when it comes to growth and longevity. Even in their current form, these decks have already lowered the barrier to entry to Classic Constructed by a lot. Before these decks, CC was a gate-kept format where the only way to get into it was to either A, find a deck list online, whether tournament or budget, and go out of your way to acquire the cards, B, learn how to build your own deck, something that is not easy for a new player, or C, have a friend or someone at locals who was willing to let you borrow a deck week after week. But now you can just buy one of these and start playing. It's that easy. And I don't know how it is at your locals, but these have been great for getting new people into the game at mine. Being able to just buy a starting deck removes so much hassle, and it's way easier to upgrade a deck like this rather than building one yourself. However, while these are a great start, they do typically need some level of upgrades to get on the same level as a more tuned list. And while I understand that these will never be as good as tournament decks right out of the box, I do wonder if powering the armory decks up just a little bit more might be what the game needs to help it truly flourish. One of the things that set me into making this video was the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure deck, Blue Eyes White Destiny. For those of you who don't know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks are a bit hit or miss, but every once in a while they drop one that's so packed to the gills with power and value that you can legitimately take 3 of them, mash them together, and you have a very solid deck that takes you to your locals. On top of that, if buying 3 of these sounds like a ripoff, I'd like to point out that they cost about $15 each, meaning that 3 of them is around the same price as a single Flesh and Blood Armory deck. But this newest Blue Eyes Structure deck goes over the top, not only including new cards and a new powerful deck engine, but also things like Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Nibiru, Called by the Grave, and Infinite Impermanence, all of which are generic staples used by a multitude of decks. This means that any new or casual player who wants to get into Yu-Gi-Oh! Can legitimately pick up 3 of these, mash them together, and have a considerably strong starting deck without any extra cards. Now here's the thing, I don't foresee LSS sticking a bunch of expensive staples in each armory deck. However, I've said before that I strongly believe that these should come with a sideboard and include solid class/talent and more specifically generic staples. I'm not saying put a playset of CNCs in these, but at the very least, things like Sink Below and Fate Foreseen. I mean, have you seen how popular assassins are? You have to run D-Reacts now. And even the base armory decks coming with just a playset of sinks and maybe a class D-React in the sideboard could be a great addition to these products. Oh, and also Arcane Barrier. I am still not over the fact that the First Strike decks have Spell Void, but the Armory decks get nothing. Now, you can make the argument that the Armory decks are already quite good and a perfectly fine product for their cost. You don't need every deck release to be some meta-defining product, but where I think LSS could, and honestly should, add a lot more power is with the Armory deck Origins products. Remember how I said that Yu-Gi-Oh! Releases a goated structure deck every once in a while? Well, the Origins decks seem like something that's only going to drop once, maybe twice a year. They feature a new hero with a whole set of new cards printed for it, including a legendary, but the deck costs about 20 bucks more. For that price, would it be too much to ask for better reprints as well? Let's take a look at Jarl again, since he's the only existing Origins deck at this time. Now, I did a wildly long review already, but one thing I did like about this deck was how, even though most of the equipment wasn't best in slot, what it came with was really solid and you didn't have to upgrade it right away. The rest of the deck, however, was not quite as good as I'd hoped. The new cards were really cool, and some of them are certainly strong enough to see play in fully tuned builds, which is great. But the only reprints of significance was Exposed to the Elements, a card that cost a whopping 50 cents. And while this card makes sense with the armor destruction theme, it's just not that good of a card, and you certainly don't want it at 3. But what if Jarl had come with, say, a Pulse of Eisenloft, a playset of Oakenolds, and maybe something like Blizzard? Add in a sideboard with some AB, Sinks, Rootbound Carapaces, and Pommels, and you've got a deck that's not 100% tuned by far, but is a much more powerful start than the Jarl deck we got. Now, obviously, the armory decks are themed, and so I can understand why they might not have considered Oaken seeing as it depicts Oldhim and not Jarl, but I still can't help but feel that a more tuned armory product, even if it's just once or twice a year, could do wonders for helping get and retain newer players. If someone joins the game and doesn't have hundreds of dollars to drop right away, it could be super helpful to have a deck that they can buy that gives them a much stronger start. Again, I think most people coming into Fab want to play what everyone else around them is, and at least where I'm from, literally everyone is playing CC. And while I and many others are more than willing to dive headfirst into the game and give LSS all our money, there's also a lot of players who need a lot more time with the game to justify the cost. In fact, when I make videos like budget staples and budget deck techs, I do so with a type of player in mind. That player being me when I was younger. See, I've been playing card games since I was 11, but it wasn't until I was about 21 when I really got into them thanks to getting a job that gave me extra money. And of course, instead of being smart and saving it, my brilliant ass went balls deep into Magic the Gathering. But before I had the extra money, I played everything on a budget. In fact, if it wasn't for budget Magic deck techs here on YouTube or being able to mash together Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks, I might not have stuck with TCGs long enough to get, well, here. In this chair, in this room, talking to all of you. And so I guess that's why I find this topic so personally important, because I imagine that there's plenty other people out there who, like myself, and I'm sure all of you, would love Flesh and Blood and who would absolutely one day become fanatics. But that day just might not be now, and so giving them a leg up with either a more casual scene, reduced prices, more budget content, and better yet, an occasional armory deck that's packed with more value as a stronger start, well, that might just be what a lot of newer players need to stick around. Of course, at the end of the day, this won't fully fix the problem. In fact, you could even argue that this isn't as big of a problem as some people make it out to be. I mean, after all, this is the internet, you know, the place people come first and foremost to complain. And as I said earlier, the game is growing, so you could even make a good argument that nothing really needs to be done, and it's fine if Flesh and Blood stays as a more competitive game that's a little harder to get into. At the end of the day, this is a luxury hobby, and even if LSS were to reprint everything into the ground and the game got less competitive, people would still find some reason to complain and be angry and not want to play. For me, I just want to help open the door a bit for those that truly do like or even love the game, but for whatever reasons just can't or aren't willing to truly invest themselves in it. At least not yet. I am, however, very interested in hearing what you all think about this. Do you think that these hurdles are even a big problem in the first place, or do you think that people are just kicking up a fuss for no reason? I personally think that the issues with price are very valid, but in terms of the skill gap, I mean, that's just always going to exist. It's just that when you have a skill gap and it's amplified by your deck being way worse than your opponent's tuned list, it feels really bad after a few months of losing over and over. Either way, these were just some of my thoughts on the topic, and if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I do hope you got something out of it. And an extra special thanks to all of my patrons for all of your support. Huge shout out to the GigaChads Geeks First, Elixir, Vinny, John, Ty, Chemical, Bryant, Dark Memoria, and Big Hungry. Then we've got the Alpha Chads, Thomas, Zajima, and Aaron, and then there's the Super Chad Stall, Cece, Ben, Yogbadoodles21, Scott, Kevin, and Wolf Shadowmancer. Thanks again as always, and stay Chadly, my friends.